Rachel Morrison gripped her wheelchair's armrests as her blind date asked if she could function normally in the middle of a crowded restaurant. The single father at the next table heard every word, and what he did next shattered her in ways she never expected. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The question came wrapped in disgust, landing on the white tablecloth like a grenade with the pin already pulled. So, are you able to, function normally? Rachel Morrison felt the blood drain from her face, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles went white. Across from her, Derek Matthews leaned back in his chair with a smirk that made her stomach turn, his eyes scanning her body with the clinical detachment of someone inspecting damaged goods at a yard sale. The restaurant hummed with the quiet elegance of expensive conversations and clinking crystal, but at their corner table, the world had just tilted into something ugly and sharp. She'd arrived at Bellissimo 30 minutes earlier, her heart doing that nervous flutter it always did before a first date, that fragile hope she couldn't quite kill no matter how many times it had been crushed. Her best friend Melissa had set this one up, swearing that Derek was different, that he was mature and ready for something real. "He's seen your profile," Melissa had insisted over the phone the night before. "He knows about the accident, Rachel. He still wants to meet you." That knowledge should have been reassuring, but Rachel had learned the hard way that knowing about her wheelchair and actually seeing her in it were two catastrophically different things. The maître d' had been kind, professional, leading her to the table with the practiced ease of someone who had seen every variation of human existence pass through these doors. She'd worn her favorite dress, a deep emerald green that brought out the color of her eyes, and had spent an hour on her hair and makeup, trying to feel beautiful, trying to feel like the woman she used to be before a drunk driver had stolen her legs, and so much more on a rainy Tuesday evening 3 years ago. Derek had been waiting at the table, and for the first 30 seconds she had felt that dangerous spark of hope ignite. He was handsome, tall, with dark hair styled just so, and a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He had stood when she approached, which she appreciated, and he had smiled, but the smile hadn't reached his eyes. Those eyes had gone wide for a fraction of a second, then narrowed, and she had seen it. That flicker of disappointment, of realization that the wheelchair in her online photos wasn't just a prop or a temporary situation. It was her reality, and his smile had become a mask. The first 10 minutes had been excruciating small talk, his answers clipped and distracted, his gaze wandering around the restaurant as if he were looking for an escape route or hoping someone more interesting might walk through the door. Rachel had tried, God, she had tried, asking him about his work in finance, about his recent trip to Spain, about the things Melissa had told her he enjoyed, but his responses were perfunctory, and the silences between them stretched like taffy, awkward and endless. Then had come the question, delivered with a casualness that made it even more vicious. "So, are you able to, function normally?" Rachel's throat constricted. She knew what he was really asking, and the crude, invasive nature of it in the middle of a first date, in the middle of a restaurant full of strangers, made her want to disappear into the floor. Her face burned with humiliation, and she felt the familiar sting of tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Tears she absolutely would not allow to fall. Not here. Not in front of him. "I function just fine," she said, her voice tight and controlled, each word carefully measured to keep the tremor out of it. Derek snorted, a dismissive sound that made her flinch. "Come on," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow felt even more public than if he'd shouted. "I mean, let's be realistic here. This isn't exactly what I signed up for. Melissa said you were in an accident, but I didn't think it's bad. I thought maybe you just had a limp or something temporary. This is," he gestured vaguely at her wheelchair, his face twisted in distaste, "this is kind of a deal breaker, The words hit her like physical blows, each one a punch to the chest, stealing her breath. Rachel had been through 3 years of physical therapy, of learning to navigate a world that wasn't built for her, of rebuilding her life from the ground up. She had endured pitying looks and awkward conversations and the loss of friends who didn't know how to relate to her anymore. But this calculated cruelty, this public dismissal of her worth as a human being, felt like a new kind of violence. She opened her mouth to respond, to tell him exactly what she thought of his deal breakers and his shallow priorities. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled with anger and hurt and a bone-deep exhaustion. Why did she keep doing this to herself? Why did she keep hoping that someone might see past the chair, might see her? At the table directly beside them, close enough to hear every word of this disaster unfolding, sat a man who had been trying very hard to mind his own business. Marcus Hayes had brought his 7-year-old daughter Sophie to Bellissimo for a special father-daughter dinner, a tradition they had started 6 months ago after Sophie's mother had decided that motherhood and marriage were too confining for her adventurous spirit and had left them both for a yoga instructor in California. Sophie was coloring on the paper tablecloth with the crayons the restaurant provided for children, her tongue poking out in concentration as she drew an elaborate princess castle. Marcus had been half listening to Sophie's running commentary about her day at school, about how Emma had shared her cookies at lunch and how Mrs. Peterson had read them a story about dragons. When the conversation conversation at the next table had cut through his awareness like a knife. He had heard the woman's quiet, dignified response to an invasive question, and then he had heard the man's response, and his entire body had gone rigid with anger. He knew that tone. He knew that dismissive cruelty. His ex-wife had used it on him more times than he could count, reducing him to a paycheck and a burden, making him feel small and worthless. But this public humiliation of a woman who was just trying to have a normal evening, this was something else entirely. His hands clenched into fists on the table, and he forced himself to take a deep breath, think before he acted. Sophie looked up from her drawing, her big brown eyes wide and concerned. "Okay," she whispered. "You look mad." Marcus glanced at his daughter, this beautiful, perceptive little girl who had already learned too much about disappointment and broken promises. He looked back at the table next to them where the woman in the wheelchair sat frozen, her face a mask of barely controlled emotion, while the man across from her was now checking his phone with obvious impatience, as if he had already mentally checked out of the evening. Marcus made a decision. He stood up, his chair scraping slightly against the floor, and walked the 3 steps to their table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice polite but carrying an edge of steel that made Derek look up from his phone with a startled expression. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." Derek's face flushed, irritation flashing across his features. "This is a private conversation," he snapped. "Mind your own business." Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "See, I'd love to," he said, his voice still calm and measured. "But you're conducting your private conversation loudly enough that my 7-year-old daughter can hear you, and I'd really prefer she not learn that it's acceptable to treat people like disposable objects." The woman in the wheelchair looked up at Marcus, her green eyes wide with surprise and something else, something fragile and hopeful. Derek's face went from flushed to almost purple. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he demanded, his voice rising. Marcus leaned down slightly, his voice dropping to a quiet intensity that was somehow more commanding than a shout. "I'm someone who knows what real character looks like," he said, "and it's not sitting across from a beautiful, brave woman and making her feel like she's less than human because she's in a wheelchair. It's pathetic, and frankly, you don't deserve to be in the same room as her, let alone at the same table." Derek stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly. His face was twisted with indignation and embarrassment. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "I don't have to sit here and be lectured by some random guy." He grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair, threw a few bills on the table without even looking at the amount, and turned to Rachel with one final, cutting remark. "Good luck finding someone desperate enough," he said. And then he was storming out of the restaurant, leaving a wake of shocked silence behind him. Marcus watched him go, then turned his attention to the woman in the wheelchair. She was staring at the table, her shoulders shaking slightly, and for a horrible moment, he thought he had made everything worse, that his intervention had just added to her humiliation. But then she looked up at him and he saw that she was crying, yes, but she was also smiling, a tremulous, disbelieving smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do that." Marcus felt his own throat tight. "Yes," he said softly, "I really did. No one deserves to be treated like that. No one." He glanced back at his table where Sophie was watching with wide eyes, her crayon frozen in midair. He looked back at the woman. "I'm Marcus, by the way, and that's my daughter Sophie. We're having a father-daughter dinner night. Would you?" He hesitated, suddenly feeling awkward. "Would you like to join us? It seems like you could use some better company, and honestly, anyone would be an improvement over that guy." Rachel Morrison stared at this stranger, this man who had just appeared like some kind of avenging angel in the middle of her worst nightmare, and felt something crack open in her chest. It was the kindness in his offer, the genuine warmth in his eyes, the way he wasn't looking at her wheelchair at all but at her face, meeting her eyes like she was a real person worthy of respect and consideration. She realized she was still crying, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face, and she fumbled in her purse for a tissue, her hands shaking. "I'm Rachel," she managed to say, her voice still unsteady but stronger now, "and I would love to join you." "Thank you. I just need a minute to compose myself. I must look like a complete mess." Marcus shook his head, his expression kind. "You look like someone who just survived something terrible with grace and dignity. Take all the time you need. I'll let Sophie know we're having a guest." He walked back to his table, and Rachel watched as he crouched down to speak to his daughter. Saw the little girl's face light up with excitement. Saw her nodding enthusiastically. Rachel took a deep breath, wiping her eyes, trying to salvage what was left of her makeup. The Mater D appeared at her side with quiet efficiency, a fresh cloth napkin in his hand. "Miss," he said softly, his voice full of sympathy, "I apologize for your experience this evening. Your dinner tonight is on the house, and if you need anything at all, please let me know. We do not tolerate such behavior in our establishment." Rachel looked up at him, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched. "That's very kind." As she wheeled herself over to Marcus and Sophie's table, she felt the eyes of other diners on her, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel ashamed. She felt angry, yes, and hurt, but also strangely empowered. Marcus had stood up for her when she had been too shocked to stand up for herself, and that simple act of human decency had reminded her that not everyone in the world was like Derek. Not everyone saw her as broken. Sophie looked up as Rachel approached, her eyes wide with curiosity but not pity. "Hi," the little girl said, her voice bright and friendly. "I'm Sophie, I'm 7. You want to see my princess castle? I'm making it have a dragon guard because princesses need protection. Rachel felt her heart warm instantly. This child, this sweet, open-hearted little girl, was looking at her like she was the most normal thing in the world. Hi, Sophie, Rachel said, settling her wheelchair at the table. Marcus quickly moved chairs aside to make room for her, his movements practiced and respectful, not making a big deal out of the accommodation. I would love to see your castle, Rachel continued, and I think a dragon guard is a brilliant idea. Princesses are usually pretty capable, so they definitely pick the strongest guards. Sophie beamed, pushing her drawing across the table. This is the tower, and this is the dragon, and this is the princess. She's wearing pants because dresses are hard to run in, and she has a sword. Marcus caught Rachel's eye and smiled. A warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. She's very practical, he said with obvious pride in his voice. Takes after her dad that way. Rachel found herself smiling back, the first real smile she'd felt all evening. I can see that, she said. A waiter appeared, and Marcus ordered drinks for the table, asking Rachel what she'd like with the easy hospitality of someone who genuinely wanted her to be comfortable. They settled into conversation with a natural ease that surprised her. Marcus told her about his work as a high school history teacher, about how he'd moved to the city 2 years ago for the job and had fallen in love with the neighborhood. Sophie interjected with stories about her class, about her best friend Emma, about the goldfish they had at home named Sir Bubbles who did tricks. Rachel found herself laughing, truly laughing, the tight knot of humiliation in her chest slowly beginning to unwind. She told them about her work as a freelance graphic designer, about the home office she'd set up in her apartment with 3 monitors and a view of the park. Sophie was fascinated, asking a dozen questions about what graphic designers did, whether Rachel had ever designed a princess, whether she could make things move on the computer. The food arrived and they ate and talked. And somewhere in the middle of the main course, Rachel realized she had almost forgotten about the disaster that had started the evening. Almost. But not quite. The memory of Derek's words still stung, still sat in her stomach like something toxic. Marcus must have seen the shadow cross her face because he set down his fork and looked at her with concern. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Sophie was distracted, carefully cutting her chicken into precise small pieces. Rachel hesitated, then decided on honesty. This wasn't the first time, she said, her voice low. The first time someone's made me feel like I'm damaged goods. It happens more than you'd think. Dating with a disability is like playing Russian roulette, except most of the chambers are loaded. You never know if someone's going to be decent or if they're going to make you feel like you're less than human. Marcus's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. That's not on you, he said firmly. That's on them. Anyone who can't see past a wheelchair to the person inside it is too shallow and stupid to deserve your time. You seem like an amazing person, Rachel. You're smart, you're funny, you're clearly talented at what you do, and you're beautiful. The fact that you use a wheelchair doesn't change any of that. It shouldn't matter, but it does matter, Rachel said, and there was a bitterness in her voice she couldn't quite hide. It matters to every single person who swipes left when they see the chair in my photos. It matters to every friend who slowly stopped inviting me places because it's too complicated to figure out accessibility. It matters to my own family, who look at me with pity every single time I visit and ask if I've considered trying some new miracle treatment they read about online. I'm tired, Marcus. I'm tired of fighting to be seen as normal, tired of having to prove I'm worthy of basic human decency. The words came out in a rush. 3 years of frustration and pain pouring out to this stranger who had shown her more kindness in 30 minutes than Derek had shown in their entire interaction. She stopped abruptly, embarrassed by her outburst. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I didn't mean to unload on you like that. Okay, you barely know me. Marcus reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. Don't apologize, he said. Not for being honest about your pain. And for what it's worth, I do know something about feeling invisible. My ex-wife left 6 months ago. Just woke up one day and decided she didn't want to be a mother or a wife anymore. Said she felt trapped, that we were holding her back from living her authentic life. She moved across the country and hasn't called Sophie once since she left. Rachel looked at him, seeing the pain in his eyes. The same exhaustion she felt reflected back at her. She glanced at Sophie, who was now building a fortress out of sugar packets, completely absorbed in her task. How do you explain that to a 7-year-old? Rachel asked softly. Marcus let out a long breath. You tell her that sometimes people make choices that hurt the people who love them, and it's not her fault. You tell her that she's loved and valued and wonderful just as she is. You tell her every single day until she believes it. He paused, then added, and you hope like hell that you're doing enough, that you're not screwing her up too badly. They sat in companionable silence for a moment. 2 wounded people who had found an unexpected connection in the wreckage of their respective disasters. Sophie looked up from her sugar packet fortress. Daddy, can Rachel come to the park with us tomorrow? She asked suddenly. You said we could go feed the ducks. Rachel would like the duck. They're very friendly. Marcus looked at Rachel, his expression hopeful but careful, not wanting to pressure her. Sophie and I have a Sunday tradition, he explained. We go to Lincoln Park, feed the ducks, maybe get ice cream if it's not too cold. You'd be welcome to join us if you'd like. No pressure at all. I know this has been an intense evening, and you might just want to go home and forget this whole night ever happened. Rachel surprised herself by not hesitating. I'd love to, she said, and meant it. What time? Sophie pumped her fist in the air. Yes, she exclaimed. This is the best dinner night ever. Rachel felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different tears. Tears of relief and gratitude and something that felt dangerously like hope. She had come to this restaurant expecting a nice evening that might lead somewhere, and instead she'd gotten the worst kind of humiliation. But somehow, impossibly, the night had transformed into something else entirely. As they finished their meal and the conversation flowed easily between them, Rachel found herself studying Marcus. He was handsome, yes, but it was more than that. He was present, engaged, the kind of father who listened when his daughter talked, who encouraged her creativity, who made her feel valued. And when he looked at Rachel, he looked at her face, her eyes, not at her wheelchair. He asked her questions about her life, her interests, her thoughts, as if she were just another person he was getting to know exactly what she was. The check came and Marcus insisted on paying despite Rachel's protest. Consider it an apology on behalf of my entire gender for that idiot's behavior, he said with a wry smile. Besides, you're our guest. Rachel finally conceded, though she made him promise she could buy ice cream tomorrow at the park. They exchanged phone numbers, and as Rachel prepared to leave, Sophie insisted on giving her a hug, her small arms wrapping around Rachel's shoulders with the uncomplicated affection of childhood. You're really nice, Sophie whispered. I'm glad that mean man left so you could have dinner with us instead. Rachel hugged her back, her heart full. I'm glad too, sweetheart, she whispered back. Thank you for sharing your daddy with me. Marcus walked with her to the restaurant entrance, where the valet was bringing her specially modified car around. The night air was cool and crisp, and Rachel could see her breath in small clouds. Thank you, Rachel said, turning to face Marcus, for everything, for standing up for me, for including me in your evening, for making what could have been the worst night of my life into something I'll actually remember fondly. You didn't have to do any of that. Marcus shook his head, his hands in his pockets, his expression sincere. I think I did, he said quietly. Not just for you, but for Sophie too. I want her to grow up seeing kindness, seeing people stand up for what's right. I want her to know that cruelty doesn't get to win, not if we don't let it. He paused, then added with a small smile and selfishly, I had a really good time tonight. Better than I've had in months, actually. Rachel felt warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten, the flutter of genuine connection, possibility. Me too, she admitted. I'll see you tomorrow at the park, 10 o'clock, Marcus confirmed. By the duck pond. Sophie will probably have her pockets full of bread by 9:30. She takes duck feeding very seriously. Rachel laughed, the sound genuine and light, and then her car arrived. The valet helped her transfer from her wheelchair into the driver's seat with practiced efficiency, folding the chair and placing it in the specially designed space in her vehicle. Marcus watched with interest but not pity, just the natural curiosity of someone learning something new. As she drove away, Rachel caught sight of Marcus and Sophie in her rearview mirror. Standing in the golden light spilling from the restaurant entrance, Sophie waving enthusiastically. Rachel waved back, a smile on her face that stayed with her all the way home. When she finally rolled into her apartment, she sat in the darkness for a long moment, processing the emotional whiplash of the eve. From devastating humiliation to unexpected connection, from feeling worthless to feeling seen, it had been a journey she hadn't anticipated. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Melissa, her well-meaning friend who had set up the disastrous date. The message read, "How did it go? Is Derek as great as I thought? Please tell me you're hitting it off." Rachel stared at the message for a long moment, trying to decide how to respond. Finally, she typed, "Derek was horrible. He humiliated me in the middle of the restaurant and left, but something unexpected happened. I'll tell you about it tomorrow." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Melissa's response came immediately, a string of shocked emojis followed by, "Oh my God, Rachel, I'm so sorry. What happened? Are you okay? Do you need me to come over?" Rachel smiled at her friend's concern. "I'm okay," she typed back. "Actually, I'm more than okay. I'll call you tomorrow." Melissa sent back a series of question marks, but Rachel set her phone down, not ready to explain the evening yet, not ready to put into words the strange and fragile hope that had taken root in her chest. The next morning, Rachel woke early, sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. She lay in bed for a moment staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd imagined the entire eve, if Marcus and Sophie were real or just some elaborate fantasy her wounded heart had conjured up. But then she checked her phone and saw a text from an unfamiliar number. "Good morning. Sophie wants me to remind you that we're meeting at 10 and that the Ducks prefer whole wheat bread to white bread. She's very specific about these things. Looking forward to seeing you, Marcus." Rachel found herself grinning like a teenager, her heart doing that nervous flutter again. But this time it felt different, less like anxiety and more like anticipation. She got ready with care, choosing comfortable jeans and a soft blue sweater, pulling her dark hair into a ponytail. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing not the wheelchair or the disability, but just herself. Rachel, a woman about to spend a Sunday morning with new friends. Lincoln Park was beautiful in the autumn light, the trees a riot of gold and crimson, the air crisp and clean. Rachel had been here dozens of times, knew every accessible path, every ramp, every smooth surface. It was one of the few places in the city where she felt truly comfortable, where the infrastructure didn't fight against her. She found Marcus and Sophie by the duck pond exactly at 10 o'clock. Sophie was wearing a bright yellow jacket and had a small backpack that appeared to be bulging with bread. "Rachel," Sophie called out, running over with unrestrained enthusiasm. enthusiasm. "I brought so much bread. We're going to make the ducks so happy today." Marcus followed at a more sedate pace, carrying 2 disposable coffee cups. "Morning," he said, offering one to Rachel. I took a guess. "Vanilla latte, 1 sugar?" Rachel accepted the cup, touched by the gesture. "Perfect guess," she said. "How did you know?" "Lucky intuition," he replied with a smile. "Plus you seem like a vanilla latte person. Classic, sweet, with good taste." They spent the next hour at the duck pond, Sophie gleefully tossing bread to the assembled waterfowl, narrating their apparent personalities and relationships with the confidence of a nature documentary host. "That one's Gerald," she announced, pointing to a particularly plump mallard. "He's the boss of all the other ducks. And that one's his wife, Geraldine. She's actually in charge, though. Gerald just thinks he is." Rachel and Marcus exchanged amused glances, both charmed by the little girl's imagination. Between Sophie's duck commentary, Rachel and Marcus talked. It was easy conversation, the kind that flowed naturally from topic to topic without effort. They discovered they both loved old movies, that they'd both read the same obscure fantasy series in high school, that they both had a weakness for terrible puns. Marcus told her more about his teaching job, about the students he mentored, about the after-school history club he ran. Rachel told him about her biggest design project, a complete brand redesign for a national nonprofit that helped disaster victims, work that had felt meaningful and important. "What happened?" Marcus asked gently after they'd been talking for a while. "The accident, I mean. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. I'm just curious about your story." Rachel appreciated that he'd asked, that he wasn't pretending the wheelchair didn't exist, but also wasn't making it the only thing about her. 3 years ago, she said, watching the ducks glide across the smooth water, "I was driving home from a friend's wedding. It was late, raining, and I was tired. I stopped at a red light, and a drunk driver slammed into me from behind, going 60 miles an hour. My car was crushed. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later with a severed spinal cord." Marcus's face was somber, compassionate. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Not in the pitying way people usually said it, but with genuine empathy. "That must have been terrifying." "It was," Rachel admitted. "The physical recovery was brutal, but honestly, the emotional recovery was worse. I lost my job because the office wasn't accessible and they didn't want to accommodate me. I lost my fiance because he couldn't handle having a disabled partner. I lost friends who didn't know how to act around me anymore. I lost the version of myself I thought I was going to be." She paused, surprised by her own honesty. "One spent a year angry," she continued. "Angry at the drunk driver, angry at the universe, angry at my own body for failing me. And then one day I realized the anger was eating me alive and I had a choice. I could let this destroy me or I could figure out how to build a new life. So I did. I learned to be a graphic designer, something I came home. I made my apartment accessible. I learned to navigate the world from this chair. I learned to be Rachel again, just a different version." Marcus was quiet for a moment, absorbing her words. "That takes incredible strength," he said finally. "I don't think most people could do that. They'd give up." Rachel shook her head. "You'd be surprised what you can survive when you don't have a choice. You keep going because the alternative is not existing, and that's not really an option. Besides," she added with a wry smile, "I'm stubborn. Always have been. My parents used to joke that I could argue my way out of anything. The wheelchair hasn't changed that." "What about you?" Rachel asked, turning the conversation to him. "You said your ex-wife left 6 months ago. How are you managing single parenthood?" Marcus let out a long breath. "Some days are better than others," he admitted. "Sophie's amazing, resilient, but she has moments where she asks about her mom, and I don't know what to say. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that her mother chose not to be in her life, that it has nothing to do with Sophie's worth and everything to do with her mother's inability to commit to anything real?" "I tell her the truth as much as she can understand," he continued. "I tell her that sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people, and that her mom is dealing with her own struggles. I tell her that love isn't about obligation, it's about choice, and that I choose her every single day. I tell her she's the best thing that ever happened to me, which is true." He smiled, but there was sadness in it. "And then I go into my room at night and wonder if I'm doing enough, if I'm screwing up her life, if she's going to need years of therapy because of my mistakes." "You're a good father," Rachel said firmly. "I can see it in the way she looks at you, the way she talks to you. She feels safe and loved. That's what matters." Marcus looked at her, something vulnerable in his expression. "Thank you for saying that. Most days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water, pretending I know what I'm doing. It helps to hear that maybe I'm not completely failing." They were interrupted by Sophie running back to them, breathless and excited. "The ducks ate all the bread," she announced. "Every single piece." Gerald said thank you. "Well," quacked, but I could tell that's what he meant. "Can we get ice cream now?" Marcus checked his watch. "Barely 11 in the morning," he said with mock seriousness. "It's awfully early for ice cream." Sophie gave him a look that was far too wise for a 7-year-old. "Daddy," she said patiently, "there's no wrong time for ice cream. That's basic science." Rachel burst out laughing. "She's got you there," she said to Marcus. "Basic science is irrefutable." Marcus threw up his hands in surrender. "Fine, ice cream it is. But you're both having lunch after, or I'm a terrible parent and a terrible friend." They walked together to the ice cream cart near the park entrance, Sophie skipping ahead, Rachel and Marcus following at a more leisurely pace. The morning had turned warm, the sun bright overhead, and Rachel felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt normal, not disabled Rachel or wheelchair-bound Rachel, just Rachel spending time with friends, enjoying a day. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt both natural and remarkable. Every Sunday, the three of them met at Lincoln Park. Sometimes they fed the ducks. Sometimes they just walked the paths and talked. Sometimes they brought a picnic lunch and spent hours under the old oak trees. Sophie had declared Rachel her best grown-up friend, a title that came with serious responsibilities like being consulted on all important decisions, from which color crayon to use to whether unicorns or dragons were cooler. Rachel found herself looking forward to Sundays with an anticipation that bordered on need. The rest of her week was full, her design business growing steadily, her social calendar filling up again as she pushed herself to reconnect with old friends and make new ones. But Sundays were different. Sundays were Marcus and Sophie. Easy laughter and comfortable silences, the feeling of being part of something warm and whole. Marcus, for his part, found that Rachel had become woven into the fabric of his life in ways he hadn't expected. He caught himself wanting to share things with her, silly observations from his day, funny things his students had said, articles he'd read that he thought she'd find interesting. They texted throughout the week, casual conversation that felt like breathing, and he realized he was telling her things he hadn't told anyone else, vulnerabilities he'd kept locked away since his wife had left. It was on a particularly cold Sunday in late October that things shifted. They had decided to skip the park due to the frigid wind and had instead gone to the Children's Museum, a sprawling indoor space full of interactive exhibits. Sophie was in heaven, running from display to display, building structures with giant foam block, conducting pretend science experiments, creating art in the craft room. Rachel and Marcus followed along, taking turns keeping up with Sophie's boundless energy. In the planetarium show, sitting in the dark with projected stars wheeling overhead, Sophie had climbed into Rachel's lap without thinking, settling there with the casual trust of a child who felt completely safe. Rachel had wrapped her arms around the little girl, and over Sophie's head, her eyes had met Marcus's in the darkness. Something passed between them in that moment, something significant and terrifying and wonderful. Marcus had reached over and gently taken Rachel's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, and she had held on, her heart pounding. After the museum, they went to a small cafe nearby, Sophie chattering excitedly about everything she'd seen. Rachel excused herself to use the restroom, and Sophie seized the opportunity. "Daddy," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Do you like Rachel?" Marcus looked at his daughter, at her serious expression, and decided on honesty. "I do," he said. "I like her very much. Do you?" Sophie nodded vigorously. "She's the best. She's nice and she's funny and she doesn't treat me like I'm a baby." She paused, then asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. "Is she going to be your girlfriend?" Marcus felt his throat tighten. He wanted to say yes, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him, but there were complications, fears, the weight of past failures. "I don't know, sweetie," he said carefully. "Rachel and I are friends right now. Good friends. Would it be okay with you if maybe someday we were more than friends?" Sophie's face split into a huge grin. "Yes," she said emphatically. "Then you could get married and Rachel could live with us and we could be a real family again." The simplicity of childhood logic, the way Sophie had already constructed a future in her mind, made Marcus's heart ache. "It's more complicated than that," he started to explain, but Rachel was returning, navigating her wheelchair through the crowded cafe with practiced skill. Whatever Sophie had been about to say was lost as she launched into a story about a girl in her class who had brought a pet hamster for show and tell. Later that evening, after Marcus had dropped Rachel off at her apartment building, after he'd gotten Sophie home and into bed, he sat alone in his living room, Sophie's question echoing in his mind. Did he want Rachel to be his girlfriend? The answer was unequivocally yes. Over the past few weeks, she had become essential to him, a bright spot in his days, someone who understood his struggles because she was fighting her own battles. She made him laugh, challenged him intellectually, listened with genuine interest when he talked about his work or his worries about Sophie. But there was fear too, the fear that he was moving too fast, that he was reading more into their friendship than was there. The fear that Rachel might not feel the same way, that she might see him as just a kind man who had helped her that night, but nothing more. And underneath it all, the deeper fear that came from having been abandoned once already, the terror of opening his heart and having it destroyed again. Rachel was facing her own internal struggle that night. She sat in her apartment, her laptop open in front of her, staring at the cursor blinking on a blank screen where she was supposed to be working on a logo design for a new client. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the feeling of Sophie's small body curled trustingly in her lap, the sensation of Marcus's hand holding hers in the darkness of the planetarium. She was falling for him. There was no point in denying it anymore. And she was falling for this kind, patient, devoted father who saw her as a complete person, not a project or a burden or a problem to be solved. But the fear was overwhelming. Every time she had allowed herself to be vulnerable, to hope that someone might love her despite the wheelchair, she had been disappointed. Her fiancé's abandonment had cut deep, but it was the smaller rejections that had done the most damage. The casual dates who never called back, the friends who slowly faded away, the family members who looked at her with pity disguised as concern. She had built walls around her heart, high and strong, and Marcus had somehow slipped past them without her noticing until it was too late. What if she told him how she felt and he didn't feel the same way? What if he was just being kind, just helping out someone he felt sorry for? Worse, what if he did feel the same way, but eventually realized that being with someone in a wheelchair was too difficult, too complicated, too much work? She couldn't survive that kind of rejection from Marcus, not after he'd made her feel seen and valued valued in ways she'd almost forgotten were possible. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Marcus. "Thank you for today. Sophie hasn't stopped talking about the planetarium. I think you've created a future astronomer. She says the stars are just like the sugar Gerald the duck ate, sparkly and everywhere." Rachel smiled, her heart simultaneously warming and breaking. She typed back, "She's amazing. You're raising an incredible kid. Tell her I'll see her next Sunday and we can talk about constellation." There was a pause, 3 dots indicating Marcus was typing, then stopping, then typing again. Finally, the message came through. "Rachel, can I ask you something?" Her heart leapt into her throat. She typed back, "Of course." Another long pause. Then, "Would you want to have dinner sometime? Just the 2 of us, I mean. Sophie loves spending time with you, and these Sundays have become the highlight of my week, but I'd really like to take you on an actual date. If you're interested, no pressure at all. I value your friendship regardless." Rachel stared at the message, reading it 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. This was the moment. She could say yes and open herself up to the possibility of something wonderful and terrifying, or she could say no, could keep things safe and friendly and protect her heart from another potential devastation. She thought about Derek, about his cruel words and dismissive attitude. Then she thought about Marcus, about the way he had stood up for her, the way he looked at her like she mattered, the way his hand had felt in hers. She took a deep breath and typed, "I would love to have dinner with you. When were you thinking?" The response came quickly, relief evident even through text. "How about Friday night? I know a great Italian place that's fully accessible." "I already checked." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes, moved by the fact that he had thought to check accessibility without her having to ask, that he was thinking ahead about her needs without making it a big deal. "Friday is perfect," she typed back. "It's a date." The rest of the week passed in a blur of anticipation and nerves. Rachel told Melissa about the upcoming date, and her friend had been thrilled, apologizing profusely again for the Derek disaster and insisting on helping Rachel pick out an outfit. They settled on a deep burgundy dress that brought out the warmth in Rachel's skin tone and made her feel beautiful and confident. Marcus, meanwhile, had confessed to his colleague and friend Tom about the date. Tom had given him endless grief about being nervous like a teenager before prom. Friday evening arrived with crisp autumn air and a sky painted in shades of orange and purple. Marcus picked Rachel up at her apartment, arriving exactly on time with a bouquet of sunflowers because, he said, he remembered her mentioning once that roses made her sneeze, but she loved sunflowers. He was wearing dark slacks and a button-down shirt that brought out the blue in his eyes, and when Rachel opened the door, the look on his face, the open admiration and warmth, made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. The restaurant was everything he had promised, a cozy Italian place with warm lighting, excellent food, and yes, completely accessible. They were seated at a corner table with a white cloth and a small candle flickering between. The conversation flowed as easily as it always did, but there was an undercurrent now, an awareness that this was different, that they were exploring new territory. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Marcus told her about his parents, both teachers who had instilled in him a love of history and learning. Rachel told him about growing up as the youngest of 3 siblings, always trying to keep up, always trying to prove she was just as capable. Over dessert, a shared tiramisu, Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "Rachel," he said, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something. I haven't felt this way about anyone since my wife left." Actually, he corrected himself, "I didn't feel this way about my wife for years before she left. What I'm trying to say is that you've become incredibly important to me. You make me laugh. You challenge me. You make me want to be better, and Sophie adores you." Rachel's heart was pounding. She squeezed his hand. "Marcus, I'm scared," she admitted. "I've been hurt so many times. People see the wheelchair and they see a burden, a complication. They leave. Everyone leaves eventually. I don't think I could handle it if you left too." Marcus moved his chair closer until he was right beside her, still holding her hand. "I'm scared too," he said quietly. "My wife leaving destroyed me. It destroyed Sophie. The idea of opening myself up to that kind of pain again terrifies me, but Rachel, being without you scares me more." He reached up with his free hand and gently touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I don't see a wheelchair when I look at you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I see a woman who survived something that would have broken most people. I see someone who gets up every morning and chooses to live fully, despite a world that makes that harder than it should be. I see someone smart and funny and kind and beautiful. I see someone who has made my daughter smile more in the past few weeks than she has in the past 6 months. I see you, Rachel. Just you." The words broke through the last of her defenses. Rachel leaned forward and kissed him, a soft, tentative kiss that tasted like tiramisu and hope. Marcus kissed her back, gentle and sure, his hand cradling the back of her head. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling, tears shining in their eyes. "Is this really happening?" Rachel whispered. "Are we really doing this?" "Think we are," Marcus whispered back. "If you want to." "God, yes," Rachel said and kissed him again. They left the restaurant hand in hand, Marcus walking slowly beside Rachel's wheelchair, both of them reluctant for the evening to end. They found a quiet bench in a small park across the street, the city lights twinkling around them like earthbound stars. They sat together, Marcus's arm around Rachel's shoulders, her head resting against him, and talked for hours. They talked about what they wanted from life, about their fears and hopes, about the practical realities of building a relationship when both of them had complicated lives and a child to consider. Sophie's going to be over the moon, Marcus said with a laugh. She's been asking me for weeks when I was going to kiss you. 7-year-olds have no subtlety whatsoever. Rachel smiled. She's a wise kid, takes after her dad. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just being together, and Rachel felt a peace settle over her that she hadn't experienced in years. This was real. This was happening. Someone saw her, truly saw her, and wanted to be with her anyway. Not despite her wheelchair, not because of some savior complex, but because of who she was as a person. The next morning, Marcus called Rachel early, his voice warm and happy. "Good morning," he said. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about last night, about you. I want to see you again. Today, if possible." Rachel, who had also barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of their date, laughed. "Sophie's going to think we're crazy if we see each other 2 days in a row outside of our Sunday tradition." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Actually, he said, "I was thinking maybe we could tell Sophie today. Together. She already knows I like you, and she's been rooting for this since the beginning. I think she deserves to know that her matchmaking worked." They met at a small breakfast place that Sophie loved, a diner with the best pancakes in the city, and a jukebox that still played records. Sophie was bouncing with energy when they arrived. Thrilled by the unexpected breakfast outing, she hugged Rachel enthusiastically, chattering about a dream she'd had about flying dolphins. As they settled into a booth, Sophie between Rachel and Marcus, there was a moment of nervous anticipation. "Sophie," Marcus said, reaching across the table to take Rachel's hand, "Rachel and I want to tell you something important. We went on a date last night, just the two of us, and we had a really good time. We like each other a lot. How would you feel if Rachel became my girlfriend?" Sophie's eyes went wide, and for a heart-stopping moment, neither adult was sure how she would react. Then her face split into the biggest grin Rachel had ever seen. "Really?" she squealed. "Really? Really? You're gonna be boyfriend and girlfriend like in the movies?" Marcus laughed, relief evident in his expression. "Really, really? If that's okay with you?" Sophie looked at Rachel with total seriousness. "Are you gonna be nice to my daddy?" she asked. He's had a hard time and his feelings get hurt easy even though he pretends they don't. Rachel felt her heart squeeze at the perceptiveness of this little girl, at her protective love for her father. "I promise," Rachel said solemnly, "to be very nice to your daddy and to never hurt his feelings on purpose. And if I accidentally do something that hurts him, I'll say sorry and try to fix it. Is that okay?" Sophie nodded, satisfied. Then she asked, "Can I still be your best grown-up friend? Or does being daddy's girlfriend mean you can't be my friend anymore?" Rachel reached out and took Sophie's small hand. "You will always be my best grown-up friend," she said firmly. "That's a forever job. Being your daddy's girlfriend just means I get to spend even more time with both of you." Sophie pumped her fist in victory. "Yes," she declared. "This is the best day ever." And I didn't even have pancakes yet. The weeks that followed were a golden time, a period of discovery and joy that felt almost dreamlike in its perfection. Marcus and Rachel fell into a rhythm, balancing date nights with family time, stolen kisses with homework help, romantic dinners with trips to the zoo. They were building something together, carefully and intentionally, making sure Sophie felt secure and included while also nurturing their relationship as a couple. Rachel started staying over some weekends, and Marcus's apartment began to accumulate her thing. A toothbrush in the bathroom, a favorite mug in the kitchen, a charger for her phone by the couch. Sophie adapted to the changes with the resilience of childhood, thrilled to have Rachel around more often. She started calling Rachel's apartment her second home, and Rachel made sure to have art supplies and books there for Sophie's visit. They developed their own traditions, Rachel and Sophie baking cookies together on Saturday morning, having movie nights with popcorn and blanket forts, painting their nails in ridiculous colors. Marcus would watch them together, these two people he loved most in the world, and feel a contentment he had never expected to find again. But not everyone was happy about the relationship. Marcus's ex-wife, Jennifer, who had been largely absent from Sophie's life, suddenly reappeared with opinions. She called Marcus one evening, her voice dripping with false concern. "I heard you're dating someone," she said. "Someone in a wheelchair?" "Marcus, don't you think that's confusing for Sophie, exposing her to that?" Marcus felt anger rise in his chest, hot and immediate. "Exposing her to what, Jennifer?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "To kindness? To someone who actually shows up for her?" "Rachel has been more of a mother figure to Sophie in 3 months than you've been in the past year." Jennifer's tone turned icy. "I'm just saying, it's a lot for a child to process. And what happens when this relationship falls apart? You'll have dragged Sophie through another abandonment. You're being selfish, Marcus." The accusation stung because it hit on his deepest fear, the worry that kept him awake some nights. Was he being selfish? Was he putting his own happiness ahead of Sophie's well-being? He pushed the doubt away. "No," he said firmly. "What's selfish is abandoning your daughter and then showing up to criticize the people who actually care for her." Rachel loves Sophie. She's patient and kind and present. Everything you're not. He hung up before Jennifer could respond, his hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. Rachel, who had been in the kitchen helping Sophie with a school project, came into the living room, concern written on her face. She'd heard enough of the conversation to understand what had happened. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Marcus nodded, then shook his head. "She's trying to get in my head," he said, making me doubt, making me wonder if I'm doing the right thing for Sophie. Rachel came closer, taking his hands. "Marcus, look at me. Sophie is thriving. She's happy and confident and secure. That's not because of your ex-wife. That's because of you. Because of the love and stability you provide. And if I can add even a little bit to that happiness, then we're doing something right." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and over the next few days, Marcus found himself second-guessing everything. Was Sophie really okay with the relationship, or was she just trying to please him? Was he moving too fast? He became quieter, more withdrawn, and Rachel noticed immediately. They were at Rachel's apartment, Sophie having a sleepover at a friend's house, when Rachel finally confronted it. "Talk to me," she said. "You've been distant all week. Did I do something wrong?" Marcus looked at her, at this woman he had fallen completely in love with, and felt the weight of his fears pressing down on him. "What if Jennifer's right?" he said quietly. "What if I'm being selfish? What if something happens to us and it hurts Sophie? She's already been through so much abandonment. Can I really risk putting her through that again?" Rachel was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus saw pain flicker across her face. "So what are you saying?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "That we should end this? Protect Sophie by pushing me away?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, and hated himself for the words even as he said them. "I just need to make sure I'm making the right choice for her." Rachel felt something crack inside her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading, the inevitable rejection she'd known was coming. Of course, Marcus would choose the safe option, would decide that being with her was too risky, too complicated. She had been a fool to believe this could work, to hope that this time would be different. "I understand," she said, her voice hollow. "Sophie has to come first. I would never want to hurt her. Maybe we should take a step back, figure things out." Marcus nodded, relief and regret warring on his face. "Just for a little while," he said, "just until I can think clearly." Rachel smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said. "Take all the time you need." After Marcus left, Rachel sat alone in her apartment, the silence oppressive and complete. She had let herself believe, had let herself hope, and now she was paying the price. The walls she had built around her heart had been breached, and now she was bleeding out, drowning in the pain of another abandonment. Her phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "How are things with Marcus? Still amazing?" Rachel stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "We're taking a break. He needs to focus on Sophie." Melissa's response was immediate. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. Do you want me to come over?" Rachel declined, not ready to put her pain into words, not ready to admit out loud that she had been right all along. Everyone left eventually, even the good ones, even Marcus. The next Sunday arrived, their traditional park day, but for the first time in months, Rachel didn't go. Sophie stood by the duck pond with a bag of whole wheat bread clutched in her small hands, scanning the paths with increasing anxiety. "Daddy, where's Rachel?" she asked for the third time in 10 minutes. "You said she was coming. You always say she's coming, and she always comes. Why isn't she here?" Marcus felt his heart constrict painfully. He had texted Rachel that morning, a careful, neutral message saying they'd be at the park as usual if she wanted to join them. She hadn't responded. He knew he deserved her silence, knew he had hurt her by suggesting they take a break, but the reality of her absence hit harder than he'd expected. "She's busy today, sweetheart," Marcus said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. "She had some work to catch up on." Sophie's face crumpled. "But it's Sunday. Sunday's our day, the three of us. Did I do something wrong? Did Rachel stop liking me?" The question broke Marcus's heart. "No, baby, no," he said, crouching down to her level and pulling her into a hug. "Rachel loves you so much. This isn't about you at all." "Then why isn't she here?" Sophie demanded, pulling back to look at him with tear-filled eyes. "We're supposed to be together. We're a family." Marcus realized in that moment the magnitude of his mistake. He'd been so focused on protecting Sophie from potential future hurt that he hadn't considered the hurt he was causing right now. Sophie had opened her heart to Rachel, had claimed her as family, and now he had driven Rachel away in the name of keeping Sophie safe. The irony was devastating. "I made a mistake," he admitted to his daughter. "I got scared and I said some things I shouldn't have. I hurt Rachel's feelings and now she's sad." Sophie's expression shifted from confusion to anger, an emotion Marcus rarely saw from his gentle daughter. "You made her sad," she said, her voice rising. "Daddy, you have to fix it. You have to say sorry. Rachel is the best thing that ever happened to us, and you made her sad." The force of Sophie's conviction, the clarity of a 7-year-old's wisdom, struck him like a physical blow. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought. His daughter understood what he had been too afraid to accept. Rachel wasn't a risk to Sophie's happiness. She was essential to it. "You're absolutely right," Marcus said, standing up and taking Sophie's hand. "Come on, we need to go see Rachel right now, and I need to apologize." They practically ran to the parking lot, leaving the uneaten bread by the pond for the confused ducks. The drive to Rachel's apartment felt interminable, Marcus's mind racing with all the things he needed to say, all the ways he needed to make this right. When they arrived, he hesitated at her door, suddenly terrified that she wouldn't forgive him, that he had destroyed something precious and irreplaceable. Sophie had no such hesitation. She knocked loudly on the door, then rang the doorbell twice for good measure. "Rachel," she called through the door. "Rachel, it's me." We need to talk to you." There was a long pause, and Marcus thought maybe Rachel wouldn't answer, that she would shut them out. He wouldn't blame her. But then he heard the sound of her wheelchair approaching and the door open. Rachel looked terrible. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing sweatpants and an old college t-shirt. She looked like she'd been crying for days, and Marcus felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him. He had done this to her. Rachel looked at Sophie first, and her expression softened immediately. "Hey, sweetie," she said, her voice hoarse. Sophie didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past Rachel into the apartment and turned to face her with her hands on her hips, a miniature warrior ready for battle. "My daddy was being stupid," she announced. "He made you sad because he got scared. But I told him he has to fix it because your family and families don't give up on each other just because they're scared." Rachel's eyes filled with fresh tears. She looked past Sophie to Marcus, who stood in the doorway, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "Sophie's right," Marcus said quietly. "I was being stupid. Can we come in? Can I explain?" Rachel hesitated, every instinct telling her to protect herself, to close the door and lock them out before they could hurt her again. But then she looked at Sophie's earnest, determined little face, and she couldn't do it. She nodded and moved aside, letting them enter. They settled in Rachel's living room, Sophie immediately climbing onto the couch beside Rachel and taking her hand. "Daddy has something to say," Sophie prompted, looking at her father expectantly. Marcus sat across from them, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, trying to find the right words. "Rachel," he began, "what I did was inexcusable. I let fear control me. My ex-wife called and got in my head, made me doubt everything. She said I was being selfish, that I was going to hurt Sophie by being with you. And instead of trusting what I knew to be true, instead of trusting us, I panicked." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. "I thought I was protecting Sophie by pulling away from you, but all I did was hurt both of you. I hurt you by suggesting that our relationship was a risk, by making you feel like you were somehow a danger to Sophie's well-being. And I hurt Sophie by taking away someone she loves, someone who has brought so much joy into her life. I was a coward, Rachel. I was afraid of being hurt again, and so I hurt the people I love most." Rachel was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. Sophie squeezed her hand tighter. Marcus continued, his voice thick with emotion. "When I look at you, I see my future. I see Sophie's future. I see a life full of laughter and love and Sunday mornings at the park. I see late-night conversations and shared dreams and someone who understands me in ways I didn't think were possible. I see the woman I love, Rachel, because I do love you. I love you so much it terrifies me." The words hung in the air, raw and honest and irrevocable. Rachel stared at him, her heart pounding. "Say something," Marcus pleaded. "Tell me I haven't completely destroyed this. Tell me there's a chance you can forgive me." Rachel wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself enough to speak. "You hurt me," she said, her voice shaking. "You made me feel exactly like I feared I would feel, like I was too much trouble. Too complicated, not worth the risk. For 3 days I've been telling myself that I was right all along, that no one would ever choose to stay with me, that the wheelchair would always be a deal breaker." Marcus made a move to stand, to go to her, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Let me finish," she said. "You hurt me, and I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen. But I also understand fear. I understand how easy it is to let it control you, to let it convince you to push away the very things that make you happy. I've done it myself more times than I can count." She looked at Sophie, then back at Marcus. "The question is, are you done being afraid? Because I can forgive you, Marcus. I want to forgive you, but I can't do this if you're going to run every time things get scary or complicated." "I'm done running," Marcus said firmly. "I promise you, Rachel. I'm done letting fear make my decisions. You are not too much trouble. You are not complicated in any way that matters. You are perfect exactly as you are, and I choose you. I choose us. Every single day for as long as you'll have me, I choose you." Sophie nodded approvingly. "See," she said to Rachel. "He gets it now, and if he forgets again, I'll remind him. Because you're my best grown-up friend, and you're going to be part of our family forever." Rachel let out a laugh that was half sob. She reached out her arms, and Sophie immediately flew into them, hugging her tightly. Marcus came over and knelt beside Rachel's wheelchair, taking her free hand. "I love you," he said again. "I love you, and I'm so sorry I made you doubt that even for a second." Rachel looked at him, at this imperfect, scared, wonderful man who had stood up for her in a restaurant, who had seen her when everyone else looked away, who loved his daughter with a fierce devotion that made her heart ache. "I love you too," she whispered, "and I forgive you." Marcus kissed her then, gentle and reverent, a kiss that felt like a promise. When they pulled apart, Sophie was grinning. "Okay," she said with satisfaction. "Now that's fixed. Can we go back to the park? The ducks are probably wondering where we are, and they're going to be so hungry." Rachel laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in days. "Absolutely. Let me get changed and we can go feed Gerald and Geraldine." As she wheeled herself toward her bedroom, Marcus caught her hand one more time. "Thank you," he said softly, "for giving me another chance, for seeing past my fear." Rachel squeezed his hand. "That's what love is," she said. Seeing past the fear to what's real. The next few months unfolded with a renewed sense of commitment and intentionality. Marcus and Rachel didn't just fall back into their routine. They built something stronger, something more deliberate. They had long conversations about their future, about what they wanted, about how to blend their lives in ways that honored both of them. They went to couples counseling not because anything was wrong, but because they wanted to build a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. Marcus made sure Rachel met his parents, and watching them welcome her into the family with open arms. Treating her wheelchair as the non-issue it should be felt like a healing balm to old wounds. Rachel introduced Marcus and Sophie to her siblings, who had kept their distance after the accident, unsure how to relate to her new reality. Seeing her with Marcus, seeing her happy in love, began to bridge that gap. Her brother apologized for his absence, admitting he hadn't known how to help, and their relationship started to slowly mend. Sophie continued to thrive, her bond with Rachel deepening every day. She started calling Rachel by a special nickname, Ray Ray, and would proudly tell anyone who would listen that her Ray Ray was the coolest grown-up she knew. At school events, Rachel would come to watch Sophie's performances, sitting in the accessible seating area while Marcus saved her a space beside him. They looked like a family, and slowly they were becoming one. One Sunday morning in early spring, 6 months after the restaurant incident that had started it all, Marcus took Rachel and Sophie back to Bellissimo. Rachel was confused when they pulled up. "Why are we here?" she asked, her stomach clenching at the memory of that awful night with Derek. Marcus smiled mysteriously. "Trust me," he said. They went inside, and the same Matter D who had been so kind to Rachel that night greeted them warmly, leading them to a table. Not just any table, but the same table where Derek had humiliated her, where Marcus had first stood up for her. Rachel looked at Marcus's confusion and something like trepidation crossing her face. "Marcus, what are we doing here? This table, this is where Derek sat, where he said all those horrible things. Why would you bring me back?" Marcus reached across the white tablecloth and took both of her hands in his. "Because I want to replace that memory with a new one," he said softly. "I want you to remember this table not as the place where someone tried to make you feel small, but as the place where everything changed, where we met, where our story began." Sophie was practically vibrating with excitement in her seat, a huge grin on her face that told Rachel she was in on whatever was happening. Marcus took a deep breath, and Rachel suddenly understood. Her heart began to race. Marcus stood up and moved beside her wheelchair, then slowly, deliberately got down on one knee. The restaurant seemed to quiet around them. Or maybe it was just that Rachel's entire focus had narrowed to this moment, to this man looking up at her with so much love it made her chest ache. "Rachel Morrison," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. "6 months ago, you walked into this restaurant expecting a disaster. You got one, but then something miraculous happened. I looked over and saw the most beautiful, brave woman I'd ever met, being treated with cruelty she absolutely didn't deserve. And I knew in that moment that I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. Standing up for you that night was the easiest decision I've ever made. But every day since then, I've made another choice. I've chosen to love you." Rachel was crying now, tears streaming freely down her face. Sophie had scooted out of her seat and was standing beside her father, holding a small velvet box that she presented to Marcus with the solemnity of a child who understood the significance of the moment. Marcus opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "You have transformed my life," Marcus continued. "You've brought light and laughter back into our home. You've shown Sophie what strength and resilience look like. You've shown me that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that choosing to open your heart even after it's been broken is the bravest thing anyone can do." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I let fear almost destroy us. But you forgave me, gave me another chance, and I swear to you that I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that forgiveness. Rachel, will you marry me? Will you let me spend forever choosing you, loving you, building a life with you? Will you be Sophie's mom officially and always? Will you be my wife?" The restaurant had indeed gone quiet now. Other diners watching with rapt attention, some with hands clasped to their chests, others openly crying. Rachel looked at Marcus, at this man who had defended her honor, who had seen past her wheelchair to the woman beneath, who had stumbled and recovered and proven that love was about choosing each other, even when it was hard. She looked at Sophie, this beautiful child who had welcomed her with open arms, who had declared her family without hesitation. "Yes," Rachel said, her voice clear and strong despite the tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and then he was standing and pulling her into his arms, kissing her while the entire restaurant erupted in applause. Sophie was jumping up and down, squealing with delight. "She's going to be my mom," she announced to anyone within earshot. "My Ray Ray is going to be my mom." The motor D appeared with a bottle of champagne, compliments of the house, and sparkling cider for Sophie. He set them down with a warm smile. "On behalf of everyone at Bellissimo," he said, "congratulations. We are honored to have been part of your story, both the difficult beginning and this beautiful new chapter." As they toasted, Rachel looked around the restaurant at the smiling faces of strangers who had witnessed their engagement, at the table that had once been the site of her humiliation and was now the site of her greatest joy. "You know," she said to Marcus, her eyes shining, "if someone had told me that that night with Derek that 6 months later I'd be engaged to a man I met because of that disaster. I would have thought they were crazy. Marcus laughed. If someone had told me I'd meet my future wife while my daughter was coloring on a tablecloth, I'd have said the same thing. That's the thing about life, isn't it? Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best one. You just have to be brave enough to stay open to the possibility. They spent the rest of the lunch in a bubble of happiness, making plans and dreaming about their future. Sophie had opinions on everything from what color the bridesmaid dresses should be, purple obviously, or maybe sparkly gold, to whether they should get a dog. Yes, definitely yes, preferably a big one that could protect the castle. Rachel and Marcus exchanged amused glances over her head, both thinking the same thing. This was their family now. This chaotic, imperfect, beautiful family. As they were leaving, an older woman approached their table. She was elegantly dressed, probably in her 70s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. Said soft, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I had to tell you something. I was here that night 6 months ago. I saw what that awful man said to you." She looked at Rachel. "And I saw this young man stand up for you when no one else did. I've thought about that night many times since, about the cruelty and the courage I witnessed." She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "To see you here today, engaged and so clearly in love, it gives me such hope. My granddaughter recently became paralyzed after a car accident. She's only 19 and she's convinced her life is over, that no one will ever love her. I'm going to tell her your story if that's all right. I want her to know that disability doesn't define worth, that love sees deeper than surface circumstances, that there are still good people in the world." Rachel reached out and squeezed the woman's hand. "Please tell her," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell her it gets easier. Tell her that she's still the same person she was before, just navigating the world differently. Tell her that the right people, the people worth having in her life, will see her for who she is. And tell her that she's stronger than she knows." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you both for being a light in the darkness." As they walked out of the restaurant, Rachel reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. The accident that had changed everything, the painful years of adjustment, the failed relationships and cruel rejections, the night with Derek that should have been the final straw, and then Marcus appearing like an avenging angel, refusing to let cruelty win. She thought about all the people who had looked at her wheelchair and seen only limitation, only burden, and then she looked at Marcus, who saw only her. The wedding planning process was joyful chaos. Sophie appointed herself the wedding coordinator, creating elaborate plans that involved doves. "A castle we can rent one, Daddy." I looked it up. "And a dragon made of balloons." Rachel and Marcus gently steered her toward more realistic options, while keeping her thoroughly involved in every decision. They chose a venue that was completely accessible, a beautiful garden with smooth pathways and ramps that didn't look like accommodations, but just like natural parts of the landscape. Rachel's family rallied around the preparations, her mother crying happy tears over dress fitting, her siblings competing to give the best toast. Even her father, who had become distant after the accident, pulled Rachel aside one day. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't know how to handle what happened to you. I was so angry at the driver, at the universe, at my own helplessness. I should have been there for you and I wasn't, but I'm here now. I'm going to walk you down that aisle if you'll let me, and I'm going to be so damn proud." Marcus's parents embraced the preparations with enthusiasm, his mother bonding with Rachel over shared recipes and gardening tips, his father engaging in long conversations with Rachel about history and politics. They never once made her feel like anything other than a beloved daughter-in-law. Sophie dragged Rachel to countless dress shops, determined to find the perfect flower girl dress, eventually settling on a purple gown with sparkles that made her look like a fairy tale princess. One evening, about 2 months before the wedding, Rachel and Marcus were alone in her apartment, curled up on the couch. Sophie was at a sleepover, giving them a rare night of quiet privacy. They were supposed to be finalizing the seating chart, but instead they were just talking. The comfortable, rambling conversation of two people who had learned to be completely themselves with each other. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't stood up that night?" Marcus asked. "If I'd just minded my own business like Derek told me to?" Rachel was quiet for a moment. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "I think I would have gone home that night and given up. I'd been rejected so many times, but Derek's cruelty was different. It was public, vicious. I think it might have broken something in me that wouldn't have healed." She turned to look at him. "You saved me that night, Marcus. Not just from Derek, but from myself. From the belief that I wasn't worthy of love." Marcus pulled her closer. "You saved me too," he said. "I was just going through the motions before I met you. Taking care of Sophie, teaching my classes, but not really living. I was so wrapped up in my bitterness about Jennifer leaving that I'd forgotten how to be open to joy. You reminded me, you and your strength and your refusal to let the world make you small. Every day with you is a reminder that life is worth living fully, that love is worth the risk." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just being together. Rachel thought about the younger version of herself, the woman who had woken up in a hospital bed 3 years ago and learned she would never walk again. She thought about the despair, the anger, the slow, painful process of rebuilding. If she could go back and tell that woman what the future held, she wasn't sure she would have believed it, that out of tragedy could come such profound happiness, that the worst night of her life would lead directly to the best. Life had a strange way of balancing the scales. she thought. For every Derek who saw her as less than human, there was a Marcus who saw her as she truly was. For every friend who had drifted away, there was a Sophie who held her hand and called her Ray Ray. For every door that had closed, a window had opened, and sometimes that window led to a garden more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. The wedding day arrived with perfect spring weather. The sky a brilliant blue scattered with white clouds that looked like they'd been painted there just for the occasion. Rachel woke early in the hotel room she was sharing with her sister Emma and her best friend Melissa, both of whom had been designated as her attendants. The morning light filtered through the curtains, and for a moment Rachel just lay there letting the reality sink in. Today she was marrying Marcus Hayes. Today she was becoming Sophie's mother. Today was the beginning of everything she'd thought she'd lost the right to hope for. Melissa appeared with coffee and pastries, setting them on the bed with a knowing smile. "Big day," she said, settling beside Rachel. "How are you feeling?" Terrified, Rachel admitted with a laugh. "Happy. Grateful. Like I might throw up or cry or both at the same time." Melissa squeezed her hand. "That sounds about right for a bride. But Rachel, I have to tell you, I've never seen you like this. You're glowing. You look like someone who knows exactly where she belongs." Emma came in from the bathroom, already dressed and makeup done, carrying Rachel's wedding dress carefully over her arms. It was a stunning creation, custom-made to accommodate her seated position. Cream-colored silk with delicate lace details and a flowing skirt that would drape beautifully over her chair. The designer had worked closely with Rachel to ensure she felt beautiful and comfortable, creating something that enhanced rather than hid her wheelchair. "Ready to get you into this masterpiece?" Emma asked. Rachel nodded, suddenly emotional. "Let's do this." The process of getting ready was filled with laughter and tears. Melissa carefully applying Rachel's makeup while Emma worked on her hair, creating an elegant updo with small white flowers woven throughout. When Rachel finally looked at herself in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked radiant, confident, beautiful. She looked like a bride who knew she was loved complete, wheelchair and all. There was a knock on the door, and Rachel's father entered, stopping short when he saw his daughter. His eyes immediately filled with tears. "Rachel's sweetheart," he said, his voice rough. "You look absolutely stunning." He came closer, kneeling beside her wheelchair so they were at eye level. "I know I haven't said this enough, but I'm so proud of you. Not just for surviving what happened, but for thriving, for opening your heart again when you had every reason to close it. Marcus is a lucky man." "Thank you, Daddy," Rachel whispered, taking his hand. "That means more than you know." Her father stood, composing himself. "Well then," he said, offering her his arm. "Shall we go make you a married woman?" The venue was more beautiful than Rachel had imagined. The garden was in full bloom, flowers everywhere in shades of purple and white, Sophie's requested colors. The aisle was wide and smooth, lined with white chairs filled with everyone they loved. At the end, under an arch covered in wisteria and roses, stood Marcus with his best man Tom beside him. And next to Tom in her sparkly purple dress stood Sophie, clutching her basket of flower petals with both hands, her face serious with the weight of her responsibilities. When the music started and Rachel began her journey down the aisle, her father walking slowly beside her wheelchair, she saw Marcus's face transform. He was crying openly, not bothering to hide his tears, his expression one of pure, unfiltered joy and love. Sophie was bouncing on her toes, barely containing her excitement. Rachel kept her eyes locked on Marcus, and everything else faded away. The guests, the flowers, the perfect weather, none of it mattered. There was only him waiting for her, choosing her, loving her. When they reached the front, her father placed a gentle kiss on her forehead, then formally placed her hand in Marcus's before taking his seat. Sophie immediately came over and stood between them, one hand in Rachel's, one in Marcus's. The officiant, a warm older woman who was a friend of Marcus's family, smiled at the three of them. "We're gathered here today," she began, "not just to celebrate the union of Marcus and Rachel, but to celebrate the creation of a family. This isn't just a wedding. It's a covenant between three people who have chosen each other, who have found in each other exactly what they needed." She looked at Sophie. "Sophie, you're not just a witness to this marriage, you're a vital part of it. Do you promise to love and support Rachel as your mother and to always be honest with both your parents about your feelings?" Sophie nodded vigorously. "I promise," she said in a clear, caring voice. "I promise to love Ray Ray forever and to tell them when I'm sad or happy or if my tummy hurts or if someone at school is mean." The guests chuckled, charmed by her specificity. The officiant turned to Marcus and Rachel. "The vows you've written for each other are not just promises about easy days and happy times. They're commitments to stand together through difficulty, through fear, through the moments when love requires courage. Marcus, you've seen Rachel's strength firsthand. Rachel, you've witnessed Marcus's devotion to his daughter and now to you. You both know that love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's hard." Marcus went first, pulling out a folded piece of paper, though Rachel suspected he'd memorized every word. "Rachel," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "The night I met you, I saw a woman being treated with cruelty by someone who couldn't see her value. But when I stood up for you, I had no idea that you would end up being the one to save me. You walked into my life, into Sophie's life, and you filled spaces we didn't even know were empty. You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's loving despite the fear." He paused, his voice thickening. "I promise to always see you, truly see you, not as someone who needs to be fixed or protected, but as my equal partner, my best friend, my love. I promise to never let fear make my decisions again. I promise to stand beside you through every challenge, to celebrate every victory, to be your safe place when the world is unkind. I promise to love you fiercely, completely, forever. And I promise to always choose you. Rachel was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. She pulled out her own vows, her hands shaking slightly as she read. Marcus, 3 years ago I lost the ability to walk, but what I didn't realize until I met you was that I'd also lost the ability to believe I deserved love. I'd convinced myself that my wheelchair made me unworthy, that I was too much trouble, too complicated. Then you looked at me in that restaurant and you saw a person worth defending. You saw me. She looked up at him, her voice growing stronger. You didn't save me because you felt sorry for me. You stood up for me because you recognized injustice and refused to let it stand. And then you loved me, not despite my disability, but as part of the whole package of who I am. You never made me feel like a burden. You made me feel cherished. She glanced at Sophie, then back at Marcus. I promise to love you and Sophie with everything I have. I promise to be patient when things are hard, to communicate when I'm scared, to trust in us even when doubt creeps in. I promise to be the mother Sophie deserves and the wife you deserve. I promise to roll through life beside you, facing whatever comes together. The exchange of rings was tender and intimate. Marcus sliding the band onto Rachel's finger with reverent care, Rachel doing the same for him with hands that trembled with emotion. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife and invited Marcus to kiss his bride, the kiss was long and sweet and full of promise. The guests erupted in applause and cheers, but the loudest sound was Sophie, who was jumping and screaming, "They're married! They're married! My daddy married my Ray Ray!" The reception was a celebration unlike anything Rachel had experienced. The venue had been set up with careful attention to accessibility, wide pathways between tables, a dance floor that was flush with the ground, everything designed so Rachel could move freely without barriers. Dinner was delicious, the speeches were heartfelt and funny, and when it came time for the first dance, Marcus had surprised Rachel by choreographing a dance that incorporated her wheelchair, spinning her and moving with her in a way that was beautiful and joyful and inclusive. But the moment that broke everyone's hearts was when Sophie approached during the father-daughter dance, tapping her dad on the shoulder. "Can Ray Ray dance with us too?" she asked. "This is a family now, we should all dance together." So the three of them danced together, Marcus pushing Rachel's chair in gentle circles while Sophie twirled around them, and there wasn't a dry eye in the venue. This was what family looked like, Rachel thought. Imperfect and unconventional and absolutely perfect. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had left and Sophie had fallen asleep on a pile of coats in the corner, exhausted from excitement, Rachel and Marcus found themselves alone on the terrace overlooking the garden. The fairy lights strung through the trees cast a soft glow, and the night air was cool and pleasant. Marcus sat in a chair pulled up beside Rachel's wheelchair, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him. "Did this day actually happen?" Rachel asked softly. "Or am I going to wake up and find out it was all a dream?" Marcus kissed the top of her head. "It happened, Mrs. Hayes. You're stuck with me now." Rachel smiled at the new name. "Mrs. Hayes. I like the sound of that." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night at the restaurant?" Rachel asked. "When you came over to our table?" Marcus thought for a moment. "I said I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, which was a polite lie because I was absolutely eavesdropping." Rachel laughed. "No, after that. You said no one deserves to be treated like disposable objects. You said I didn't deserve to be in the same room as Derek, let alone at the same table." She turned to look at him. "You saw my worth before I could see it myself. You defended my humanity when I was ready to believe I'd lost it." Marcus cupped her face gently. "You never lost it, Rachel. It was always there. Sometimes we just need someone to hold up a mirror and remind us who we really are. You did the same for me, you know. Before I met you, I was so angry at Jennifer, so bitter about being abandoned. You showed me that not everyone leaves. You showed me that some people stay, that some people choose to love even when it's hard. You taught me that being vulnerable isn't weakness. It's the only way to truly live." They kissed, slow and tender. A kiss that tasted like champagne and wedding cake and the promise of forever. Married life brought its own rhythms and adjustments, but Rachel had never been happier. They had decided to sell both of their apartments and buy a house together, something with a yard for Sophie and full accessibility for Rachel. The house hunting process had been an adventure. Marcus learning things he'd never considered about doorway widths and bathroom modifications. Rachel patient as she explained what she needed versus what would just be nice to have. They finally found a beautiful craftsman-style home with an open floor plan, wide hallways, and a master bedroom on the first floor. The backyard had an old oak tree perfect for a swing, and enough space for the garden Rachel had always dreamed of planting. Sophie had her own room upstairs, painted purple at her insistence, with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that Marcus spent an entire weekend installing. But more often than not, she ended up in Rachel and Marcus's room in the morning, climbing into bed between them for cuddles before school. Rachel had officially adopted Sophie 3 months after the wedding, a court proceeding that had left all three of them in tears. When the judge had declared it official, Sophie had thrown her arms around Rachel and whispered, "Now you're really my mom forever and ever, and nobody can change it." Rachel Rachel's design business continued to flourish, and she set up a beautiful home office with huge windows overlooking the garden. She had started taking on projects specifically focused on accessibility design, working with businesses and public spaces to create environments that welcomed everyone. It was meaningful work, turning her own experiences with an inaccessible world into solutions that would help others. Marcus had been promoted to department chair at his school, a recognition of his dedication and skill as a teacher. Life wasn't perfect, of course. There were still challenges, still moments when the world reminded them that not everyone saw things the way they did. There was the time a restaurant hostess had tried to seat them at a table in the back corner, away from other diners, assuming Rachel would prefer to be hidden. Marcus had politely but firmly requested a better table, his protective instincts flaring. There was the incident at Sophie's school when another child had asked loudly why Sophie's mom was in a wheelchair, and the child's mother had shushed her and pulled her away as if Rachel's disability was something shameful that shouldn't be discussed. Rachel had handled it with grace, as she always did, explaining to Sophie later that some people were uncomfortable with things they didn't understand, and that education was usually better than anger. But Marcus had seen the hurt in her eyes, the momentary flash of that old pain, and his heart had ached for her. He found himself becoming more aware of the subtle and not so subtle ways society marginalized people with disability. The assumptions and barriers that Rachel navigated every single day with a strength he couldn't fathom. It was about 8 months into their marriage when they faced their biggest test. Marcus came home from work one day to find Rachel in tears in their bedroom, her laptop open in front of her. He immediately knelt beside her chair, alarm racing through him. "What happened?" he asked, searching her face for clues. "Talk to me." Rachel gestured at the screen where her email was open. She had received a message from a potential client, a high-profile tech company that wanted to hire her for a major rebranding project. It was the kind of job that could take her career to the next level, significant money and exposure. "That's amazing," Marcus said, confused about why she was crying. "Rachel, this is huge. Why are you upset?" She clicked to another email in the thread, one that had come an hour after the initial offer. The client had apparently done some research on her, found her social media and website where she didn't hide her disability. The second email was a withdrawal of the offer, with a flimsy excuse about budget constraints. But the subtext was clear. They didn't want a designer in a wheelchair representing their brand. Marcus felt rage build in his chest, hot and immediate. "That's discrimination," he said, his voice tight. "That's illegal. You could sue them. You should sue them." Rachel wiped her eyes, shaking her head. "I could try, but proving discrimination is nearly impossible. They'll just say it really was about budget or timeline or any number of excuses. Fighting it would take months, cost money, and drain my energy. For what? To force them to work with someone who clearly doesn't value me? I don't want clients who see me as a liability." She looked at Marcus, her expression devastated. "The worst part is that I let myself hope. I let myself believe that maybe I'd gotten past this, that my work was finally being judged on its merit and not on my wheelchair. I was stupid to think it could be different." Marcus took her hands, his voice fierce. "You are not stupid. They are ignorant and they are bigots and they don't deserve your talent. But Rachel, please don't let them make you believe you're anything less than extraordinary. Your wheelchair doesn't diminish your worth or your abilities. It never has." "I know that in my head," Rachel said, her voice breaking, "but sometimes it's so hard to believe it in my heart. Sometimes I'm just so tired of fighting, tired of proving myself over and over again, tired of being seen as an inconvenience or an inspiration or anything other than just a person trying to do good work." Marcus pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried, feeling helpless and furious. He wanted to fix this, to protect her from every slight and prejudice, but he couldn't. All he could do was be there. Be solid ground when the world felt unstable. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Rachel and Marcus sat together in their living room. Marcus had been thinking all evening, an idea forming. "What if you used this?" he said carefully. "Not for revenge, but for education. What if you wrote about this experience? You have a platform now, followers who respect your work. What if you shared what happened and why it's wrong? Not to shame the company, though they deserve it, but to show other people with disabilities that they're not alone. To show businesses why this kind of discrimination hurts everyone." Rachel was quiet for a long time, considering. "I've always tried to keep my disability separate from my work," she said finally. "I didn't want to be the disabled designer. I wanted to just be a designer who happens to be disabled. But maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe by not talking about it, I'm letting people continue to think it's something to hide or overcome." Marcus nodded. "You've never been ashamed of who you are. Why should your professional life be any different?" Over the next few days, Rachel wrote a blog post about her experience. She talked about the reality of being a disabled professional, about the assumptions and barriers she faced, about the incident with the tech company. But she also wrote about resilience, about the importance of judging people on their abilities rather than their limitation, about the value that diverse perspectives bring to any field. She was honest about her hurt and anger, but she was also hopeful, calling for change rather than simply complaining about the status quo. When she posted it, the response was overwhelming. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times. Other disabled professionals reached out to share their own stories, to thank her for giving voice to experiences they'd kept silent about. Several major publications asked to interview her, and perhaps most significantly, 3 different companies reached out offering her project, specifically saying they valued her perspective and expertise. The tech company that had rejected her faced a social media backlash they hadn't anticipated. Their discriminatory practices exposed and criticized plans publicly. But the moment that meant the most to Rachel came from an unexpected source. She received an email from a young woman named Jennifer, who had been paralyzed in a diving accident a year earlier. Jennifer wrote that she had been considering giving up on her dream of becoming an architect, convinced that her disability made it impossible. Reading Rachel's story had given her hope. "If you can fight for your place in your field," Jennifer wrote, "then maybe I can too. Thank you for not hiding. Thank you for showing me that being disabled doesn't mean giving up on who you're meant to be." Rachel showed the email to Marcus, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were different. Tears. "I think I understand now," she said, "why this happened. Not that it was fair or right, but why it mattered. If my pain can help even one person feel less alone, if my struggle can open even one door for someone else, then maybe it wasn't meaningless." Marcus kissed her forehead. "Your pain was never meaningless," he said gently, "but I'm proud of you for turning it into something powerful." The incident became a turning point for Rachel's career. She started speaking at conferences about accessibility and design, consulting with companies not just on their branding, but on how to create inclusive workplaces and products. She became an advocate, not because she set out to be one, but because her experiences and her willingness to share them made her one. And through it all, Marcus and Sophie were her foundation, the safe harbor she returned to when the fight got exhausting. Sophie was thriving in ways that amazed them both. She was confident and compassionate, quick to stand up for other kids who were being excluded or bullied. When a new student joined her class, a boy who used a walker due to cerebral palsy, Sophie immediately befriended him and made sure he was included in games at recess. Her teacher called to tell Rachel and Marcus how proud she was of Sophie's kindness, and that evening at dinner, they praised her. Sophie had shrugged as if it was obvious. "You taught me that people are people," she said simply. "It doesn't matter if they walk or roll or use crutches or whatever. What matters is if they're nice and if they share their cookies." Rachel and Marcus had exchanged looks across the table, both thinking the same thing. They were raising a good human, someone who would make the world a little bit better just by being in it. 1 year after their wedding, they returned to Bellissimo for an anniversary dinner. The same Mater D greeted them warmly, remembering them and their story. "Your usual table?" he asked with a knowing smile. "Actually," Rachel said, "could we sit somewhere else tonight? I love that table and what it represents, but I think I'm ready to make new memories in new places." The Mater D nodded approvingly and led them to a beautiful table by the window overlooking the city lights. As they sat down, Marcus raised his glass. "To new memories," he said. "To moving forward while honoring where we've been. To the worst blind date that ever happened and the best thing that came from it." Rachel clinked her glass against his, smiling. "To standing up for what's right even when it's scary. To seeing people truly, completely, without filters or prejudice. To love that chooses every single day." 5 years later, Rachel stood in front of a packed auditorium, the bright stage lights making it impossible to see most of the faces in the crowd, but she could feel their attention, their anticipation. She was the keynote speaker at the National Design Conference, addressing over 2,000 designers, business owners, and accessibility advocates. Her topic was one she knew intimately: designing for everyone. Why inclusion isn't optional, it's essential. She took a breath, steadied herself, and began to speak. 5 years ago, Rachel said, her voice clear and confident, "I was rejected for a major project because a company didn't want a designer in a wheelchair representing their brand. It was devastating. It made me question my worth, my abilities, everything I'd worked so hard to build. But that rejection changed the trajectory of my career and my life. It forced me to stop hiding, to stop pretending my disability was separate from who I am as a designer. Because the truth is, my perspective as someone who navigates an often inaccessible world makes me a better designer. I see barriers that others miss. I understand exclusion in ways that inform more thoughtful, inclusive solutions." She clicked to the next slide, showing before and after images of various accessibility projects she'd worked on. The audience leaned forward, engaged. "Every time you design something, whether it's a website, a building, a product, or a brand, you're making a choice about who gets to participate in the world you're creating. When you design only for able-bodied people, you're not just inconveniencing disabled people. You're telling them they don't matter. You're saying their participation is optional, an afterthought. But when you design with inclusion from the beginning, everyone benefits." The presentation continued for 40 minutes, Rachel weaving together research, personal anecdotes, and practical strategy. She talked about universal design principles, about the economic and ethical imperatives of accessibility, about the creativity that comes from considering diverse perspectives. When she finished, the standing ovation was thunderous and long. People were crying, inspired, energized. Several attendees lined up afterward to talk to her, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. Among them was a young man in his 20s, nervous and earnest. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I'm a design student and I'm also autistic. I've been afraid to disclose that to potential employers because I don't want to be seen as less capable. But hearing you speak, seeing what you've built, it gives me hope that maybe I don't have to hide who I am. Maybe my perspective is actually valuable." Rachel reached out and took his hand. "It is valuable," she said firmly. "The world needs designers like us. People who understand what it feels like to be excluded. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you need to minimize yourself to be accepted. The right people, the right opportunities, they'll see your worth." That evening, Rachel returned to her hotel room emotionally exhausted but fulfilled. She video called Marcus and Sophie, who were back home. Sophie, now 12 years old and in 7th grade, appeared on the screen first, her face breaking into a huge grin. "Mom," she said, and Rachel's heart still squeezed every time Sophie called her that. "How was your speech? Did you make everyone cry like you did when you practiced on us?" Rachel laughed. "A few people definitely cried. I think it went well." "How was school?" Sophie launched into a story about her science project on renewable energy, and Rachel listened, asking questions. Proud of this brilliant, passionate girl who challenged teachers and stood up for her friends and wanted to change the world. Marcus appeared behind Sophie, wrapping his arms around their daughter. "She's not mentioning that she got selected for the advanced math program," he said. Sophie rolled her eyes. "Dad, it's not a big deal." "It kind of is, sweetheart," Marcus said, kissing the top of her head. "We're proud of you." After they said goodnight to Sophie, Marcus and Rachel talked quietly, the intimacy of shared parenting and partnership evident even through a screen. "I miss you," Marcus said. "The house feels empty without you. I'll be home tomorrow night," Rachel promised. "And then we have 3 whole days with no travel, no events, just us. I can't wait." They talked for another hour, about Sophie's upcoming school dance, about the garden that needed weeding, about Marcus's newest history curriculum project, about the mundane, beautiful details of their shared life. When they finally hung up, Rachel sat for a moment in the quiet hotel room, marveling at how far she'd come. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 years ago, sitting in Bellissimo across from Derek, feeling humiliated and worthless. That woman had believed she was unlovable, that her disability made her less than whole. She had been so close to giving up on the possibility of happiness, of partnership, of being seen. And then Marcus had appeared, this stranger who had refused to let cruelty win, who had seen her humanity when she could barely see it herself. He had changed everything, not by saving her, but by reminding her that she was worth standing up for. The next day, Rachel was waiting at the airport for her flight home when she saw him. Derek Matthews, looking exactly the same. Expensive suit and polished shoes, walking through the terminal with the same arrogant stride she remembered. He was on his phone, laughing at something, completely unaware of her presence. Rachel felt her heart rate spike, that old hurt and humiliation threatening to resurface. She could just stay quiet, let him pass by without acknowledging him. But then she thought about the young autistic designer from yesterday, about all the people who needed to see that disability didn't equal defeat. She wheeled herself directly into Derek's path. He looked up from his phone, irritation crossing his face, then recognition, then shock. "Rachel," he said, her name awkward on his tongue. "Wow. I didn't expect to run into you." Rachel smiled, and it was genuine, without bitterness. "Derek," she said calmly, "how have you been?" He stammered something about work being busy, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, about that night at the restaurant," he started, but Rachel held up her hand. "I don't need an apology," she said. "I mean, you should apologize because what you did was cruel and inexcusable, but I don't need it for me. I'm happy, Derek. Genuinely, completely happy. I have an incredible husband who sees me as a complete person. I have a daughter I adore. I have a career I'm passionate about. Your opinion to me 6 years ago, your inability to see past my wheelchair, that's not my problem, it's yours. You missed out on knowing someone pretty amazing because you couldn't get past your own narrow prejudice." Derek's face flushed red. He started, but seemed unable to find words. Rachel continued, her voice gentle now. "I hope you've grown since then. I hope you've learned to see people as more than their surface characteristics, because the world is full of incredible people in all kinds of packages, and if you keep judging them by appearance or ability or any superficial measure, you're gonna miss out on so much richness and connection." She paused. "Anyway, I hope life treats you well, truly." And with that, she wheeled past him toward her gate, leaving him standing speechless in the middle of the airport. On the plane home, Rachel reflected on the encounter. 6 years ago, running into Derek would have destroyed her, would have brought back all the pain and self-doubt. But now, she felt nothing but pity for him, for the smallness of his worldview, for all he was missing because of his prejudice. She had moved so far beyond that night. It built a life so full and beautiful that his cruelty couldn't touch her anymore. That was the real victory, she realized. Not proving him wrong, but becoming so secure in her own worth that his opinion was irrelevant. When the plane landed and Rachel made her way through the airport to baggage claim, she saw them immediately. Marcus and Sophie holding a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Mom. You're our hero." Sophie was bouncing with excitement, and when she saw Rachel, she broke away from Marcus and ran, throwing herself carefully into Rachel's lap for a hug. "I missed you so much," Sophie said, her arms tight around Rachel's neck. "Dad let me have pizza for dinner 2 nights in a row, and I think he forgot to make me brush my teeth once. But don't be mad at him because he tried really hard." Rachel laughed, looking up at Marcus, who shrugged sheepishly. "She's not wrong about the pizza," he admitted, "but I definitely made her brush her teeth, mostly." He leaned down and kissed Rachel, long and sweet, right there in the airport. "Welcome home," he murmured. "The house has been too quiet without you." As they walked to the car together, Sophie chattering about everything Rachel had missed, Marcus pushing Rachel's suitcase while holding her hand. Rachel felt overwhelming gratitude wash over her. This was her life now. Not despite the accident, not despite the wheelchair, not despite all the pain and rejection and struggle, but because of the strength she'd gained from surviving it all, because she'd refused to let the world make her small, because Marcus had seen her worth and reflected it back until she could see it herself, because Sophie had taught her that family was about choice and love, not biology or conventional expectation, because every challenge had made her more compassionate, more resilient, more determined to create a world where everyone was seen and valued. That night after Sophie had gone to bed and Marcus and Rachel were curled up on the couch together, Rachel told him about the encounter with Derek. Marcus listened, his expression shifting from anger to admiration. "What did he say?" Marcus asked. "When you told him all that?" Rachel smiled. "Not much. I don't think he knew what to say." But Marcus, the amazing thing was that I didn't need him to say anything. His opinion doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't hurt anymore. I've moved so far past that night, past that version of myself who believed what he implied about my worth. Marcus pulled her closer. "You know what I think?" he said softly. "I think that night at Bellissimo when I walked over to your table, I wasn't saving you. You were saving me. You were saving both of us. Rachel, you've taught me more about courage and resilience than anyone I've ever known. You've shown Sophie what strength looks like. You've changed lives through your advocacy work. You took the worst moment of your life and transformed it into something meaningful." Rachel kissed him, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. "Maybe we saved each other," she said. "Maybe that's what love is. Not one person rescuing another, but two people choosing to see each other truly, to stand together, to build something beautiful out of broken pieces." They sat in comfortable silence, the life they'd built together wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Outside, the world continued its complicated dance of cruelty and kindness, barriers and bridges, pain and healing. But inside their home, in this moment, there was only love. Love that had started with a stranger's refusal to let injustice stand unchallenged. Love that had grown through vulnerability and forgiveness. Love that chose every single day to see past surface differences to the humanity beneath. Love that had transformed a humiliating blind date into a beautiful family, a painful rejection into a powerful purpose, a wheelchair into just one part of a whole, complete, extraordinary person. And that, Rachel thought as she drifted off to sleep in Marcus's arms, was the real story. Not the tragedy of what she'd lost, but the miracle of what she'd found. Not the cruelty of one man, but the kindness of another. Not the barriers the world had placed in her path, but the determination with which she'd overcome them. Her story wasn't about a disability. It was about discovering that love sees deeper than the world does, that courage is choosing vulnerability, and that sometimes the worst moments lead to the very best one, if you're brave enough to stay open to the possibility.